This week we're going to look at abortion. As I'm sure you're all aware, abortion is a controversial topic. And I want to caveat this lecture, and I'll repeat this at the very end too, so it's bookended, that we are not going to arrive at a definitive answer of when abortion is right or wrong, or what the correct argument is to justify abortion, or to justify why abortion is not morally permissible. Instead, I picked two articles for different reasons. The first one is an article that is geared towards this concept of a person, which seems to be pretty fundamental to all the different abortion debates. So I think it's really interesting to look at that so we can unpack what it means to be person, and to sort of talk a little bit more about the ethical implications of our interpretation of what counts as a person. So that's why I picked the first article. The second article is a little bit more of a survey of different perspectives on the abortion debate, and that's just to more or less prepare you for what you might encounter in the healthcare field. So we'll talk about both of these. One is supposed to be getting more into depth, and the other one's supposed to provide you with breadth. But by no means should you think that walking away from this lecture series or this lecture that you're going to arrive at a perfect concrete argument for or against abortion. So we're going to start with the English article, and then we're going to look at the two thought experiments that English presents, which I really like, to flesh out why the sort of argument for a person doesn't seem to work for either side of this debate. And then we'll look at Gillen's article to sort of review the different perspectives on the abortion topic. Before we dive into English's article, I wanted to say a little bit more about the abortion debate and papers that exist out there. So the two common papers that get assigned for abortion conversations and ethics courses are Judith Jarvis Thompson's A Defense of Abortion, and then Don Marquis' Why Abortion is Immoral. So both of those are pretty standard within the ethics classrooms, which is why I avoided them here, just in case if you took an Introduction to Ethics course. If you were to take an Introduction to Ethics course with me, those would be the two that we would talk about. So that's why I didn't pick them for this class, just because I didn't want repetition if somebody here has already been in an intro ethics course and have read those. If you haven't and you're interested, both of them are free online. If you just Google Judith Jarvis Thompson, A Defense of Abortion, and Why Abortion is Immoral by Don Marquis, you can find both of those papers. They're very accessible. Both of them provide arguments that are easy to follow. Thompson's especially provides a number of thought experiments that are pretty well known. You can find YouTube videos on those. So the violinist example is the most famous one. But why I chose this English article is partly because it's got a pretty strong connection with the Thompson article. Insofar as Thompson's article was written in 1971, this English paper was written in 1975. And they're both dealing with the person concept, and English's conclusion here is pretty similar to Thompson's, because Thompson is going to make this argument or show how even if the fetus is considered a person, we need more moral justification to say why a fetus deserves priority over the woman in the situation. So just by saying that the fetus is a person isn't a convincing argument. We have to ultimately explain why the fetus, being a person, has more claim to, self-determination than the woman does. And so even though Thompson's paper is called A Defense of Abortion, again, she's not going to argue in favor of abortions all the time. And so, again, I really like that paper. If you are not going to take another philosophy course, shame on you. Just kidding. But I would highly suggest reading it. It's a really fun paper. It's not going to try to convince you to be on the side of, always justifying abortions or anything like that. It's just trying to say, let's look at the arguments and show how the arguments that are used are not convincing, and it's not that they can't provide a convincing argument, it's just you should not be resting on this. So again, that's just me trying to stress that I'm not trying to convince you one way or another on this abortion debate, just trying to make you aware of some resources that are really interesting and get you thinking about this issue. So with that being said, I wanted to move on to the actual article. So English's article, as I was just saying, is somewhat of a follow-up to Thompson's. And here she's trying to say that if you're pro-life or pro-choice, regardless, the argument that uses the concept of a person ultimately fails. So she's talking here that there are these two common arguments that involve personhood. The first one is abortion is wrong because the fetus is a person. That's the pro-life account. And then the pro-choice account is that the fetus is not a person, so abortion is justifiable. And what she's going to ask us here is, what do we count as a person? And you might think, well, that's just dumb. This is just trying to do the gotcha, clickbait type. Tell me what you mean by X, and then show you that, or I can show you that you don't know how that's defined. But the idea here is that we make a lot of different moral judgments based on the property of being a person, and it's not as easy to decipher what counts as a person. Back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there was a huge push for IQ, and so this is the environmental ethicist side of my knowledge here. So we were talking about Peter Singer before, and one of his arguments for animal rights is that when we try to make this distinction between humans and non-humans, we often appeal to things like IQ. But you can find a number of people who have a low IQ and say monkeys or gorillas or octopuses, if that's the plural version of octopus. But IQ would ultimately lead us to this weird place in which we'd say it's okay to experiment on humans as long as they have a sufficiently low IQ, which is lower than some non-human, which none of us would agree to. I think somebody with learning disabilities or are mentally handicapped, we would say it's wrong to just experiment or do whatever we want on them, just like we would on an animal or something like that. And so that was Singer's argument, that when we're trying to make these distinctions between what counts as a human, what counts as a non-human, they usually rest on this arbitrary distinction that I can always show an exception here. And so instead, there is a way around this. I'm, again, not trying to do like clickbait, oh, you can't tell me what a person is. Instead, I'm just trying to say this more nominalist take, which is that we have this idea of a person, which is this cluster of features where rationality is typically pretty central, and also this concept of self, like we think of ourselves as an ego and we operate in the world, we are always shaping our character and stuff like that, and being conceived of humans are only part of that feature. And so what English is going to say here, and a lot of philosophers, and this is where the meta-ethics is getting into it, where defining what a person is complicated, and we can't just give ourselves a list of features that we can just tick off. There are only features that are more or less typical. And so basing our arguments off of this whole person concept, when we can't really define what a person is neatly, right, becomes problematic. And so English is going to arrive at this conclusion that the application of the person concept will not suffice to settle the abortion issue. This is about the quality of the arguments and not about abortion as a practice per se, right? So again, she's not trying to say that the pro-choice or the pro-life perspective is inherently wrong. It's rather that they both rest on this interpretation of person as a concrete, particular concept, and instead we have these bundles of features that are associated with personhood that are more or less typical. And so now what I want to do is I want to look at the two thought experiments that she presents in here and talk through them to show why she thinks that both of these sides do not necessarily succeed in their argument because they're based on this person concept. So let's start with the mad scientist case. It starts on page 235 if you want to check it out. I'm going to actually end up reading quite a bit of it to you, but it's there if you want to look at it for yourself or refresh. So the mad scientist case is about the self-defense model. It's trying to help us understand it. The idea is that you have this mad scientist who is hypnotizing people and sending them out to cause violence onto other people. I couldn't find any, hypnotized people chasing down others, so you have to deal with zombies here because I refuse to use AI software. So just pretend that those zombies are real people who are just being hypnotized. And here's you. They're coming after you to attack you. The question is, could you rightfully shoot, kill these people who are chasing after you and are going to try to kill you? If your answer is yes, then the question is, why is that permissible? These people are innocent. They're just hypnotized. You might think, I have a right to self-defense. And that is the idea behind the self-defense model, is that because these people are coming to cause you harm, even though they're innocent, doesn't mean that you have to just allow them to cause those harms to you. So that's the first part of it. That's just the basic premise of what's going on here. And the next variation, we get a number of variations. The next variation is, would it be permissible for somebody to stop these hypnotized people on your behalf? Would you be allowed to hire a bodyguard, and would that bodyguard be empowered to act on your behalf to keep them from causing you harm? And again, English is going to appeal to our moral intuitions, which would say, well, sure, if I can't defend myself, it doesn't mean that the hypnotized zombie people have the right to cause that harm to me. I have a right to protect myself. And so all I'm doing is empowering somebody else or transferring my agency to that person. And the reason why English presents this variation of the case is to say that, the bodyguard is like a doctor or physician who would perform the abortion. You are authorizing somebody else to act on your behalf. And so if the bodyguard is allowed to stop these people because you authorize them to, that seems to be a parallel with the physician-patient relationship to providing an abortion. So that's the second variation. The third variation, and this is where I'm going to have to start reading from the text. I think she puts it, actually, wait, no, I'm incorrect. I got one more version here. So you might be thinking that, okay, if these people are trying to harm me, just like if the pregnancy presents a life-threatening condition, then maybe abortion is justifiable because, again, we're talking about two people. They're on equal standing as people. And so let's now change the circumstances. What if the zombies are just going to kidnap you and return you to the mad scientist to brainwash you now? And as English suggested, imagine that you are a surgeon. You've been investing all of your time into developing this trade, and if you get hypnotized, then you're no longer a surgeon. You're no longer able to sort of achieve the type of goals that you had set out for yourself. You might not, you wouldn't be making as much money anymore. And so are you right to protect yourself from these zombies in this case? English is going to say, yeah, we're probably inclined to think that we're allowed to protect ourselves because this is our welfare and our well-being, and that if there is some serious threat to that, that these consequences, if there are adverse lifelong consequences, then it seems like we're justified in preventing this harm to us. So this would be a case in which if you have a pregnancy and it's ultimately going to keep you from achieving certain goals, that's supposed to be the parallel here. Again, this is not an argument in favor or in favor of abortions no matter what, or if it's going to cause some sort of obstacle. That's not what's going on here. Instead, what we're doing with this thought example is trying to appeal to these moral intuitions that are connected with the self-defense model, which is to say, if somebody were to impede your ability to excel in a certain way, just like a stranger on the street, you would give the argument that they are not justified to do that, and you are allowed to stop them by any means necessary. And so if a fetus is equally a person, just as a stranger is a person on the street, why does one argument apply to one set of people and the argument doesn't apply to another set of person or another person? That's what's going on with this thought experiment. And that's why the zombies are supposed to be innocent people who are brainwashed, just like a fetus would be an innocent person who didn't cause any, doesn't mean any harm and doesn't actually intend to cause it. That's what I was trying to get to. So that's the first check-in point with what's going on here. Now, I think what's interesting is this, how English ends this section and ties the thought experiment with a number of different other considerations about abortion. So I apologize. I'm going to read a lot of what she has written here because I just don't think that I can state it in a better way. So here is the last variation. Imagine we still have these hypnotized people who are coming to chase everybody down and cause these harms. Now, during the day, they aren't out. And so you can freely walk around during the day without worrying about these hypnotized people coming to attack you, but they do come out at night. And so here's where I'm going to start reading. This is on page 239. So it starts, several parallels arise between various views on abortion and the self-defense model. Let's suppose further that these hypnotized attackers only operate at night, so that it is well known that they can be avoided completely by the considerable inconvenience of never leaving your house after dark. One view is that since you could stay home all night, therefore if you go out and are selected by one of these hypnotized people, you have no right to defend yourself. This parallels the view that abstinence is the only acceptable way to avoid pregnancy. So the idea is that if you think that it's an abstinence only situation, then you would have to say that in this situation you should be sequestered inside, and if you ever leave your house at night, then it's ultimately on you for what happens. She continues, others might hold that you ought to take along some defense, such as mace, which will deter the hypnotized people without killing, but that if the defense fails, you are obliged to submit to the resulting injury no matter how severe it is. This parallels the view that contraception is all right, but abortion is always wrong, even in cases of contraceptive failure. So I think that's pretty straightforward, right? If you take the risks, but you take some type of protection with you, and the idea is that that's the view that you can use contraception, but if it fails, then abortion is still wrong. Again, I think the appeal here is that we would not accept that on most grounds within this thought experiment. Continuing on, a third view is that you may kill the hypnotized person only if he will actually kill you, but not if he will only injure you. This is like the position that abortion is permissible only if it is required to save a woman's life. Pretty straightforward there. Finally, we have the view that it is all right to kill, the attacker, even if only to avoid a very slight inconvenience to yourself, and even if you knowingly walked down the very street where all these incidents have been taking place without taking along any mace or protective escort. If we assume that a fetus is a person, this is the analog of the view that abortion is always justifiable on demand. So what's the point here with this argument, and let's make sure we're getting the right conclusion. So continuing on, she says, the self-defense model allows us to see an important difference that exists between abortion and infanticide, even if a fetus is a person from conception. Many have argued that the only way to justify abortion without justifying infanticide would be to find some characteristic of personhood that is acquired at birth. Then she talks about Michael Toole. Skipping down a little bit. Here's how she concludes it. So birth is the crucial point, not because of any characteristics the fetus gains, but because after birth, the woman can defend herself by a means less drastic than killing the infant. Hence, self-defense can be used to justify abortion without necessarily thereby justifying infanticide. So that's the key thing that we're getting from this section here, and what the thought experiment is supposed to be doing is to show that even though we have this concept of person that we are associating with the fetus, even if we grant it at conception, that the argument still doesn't run that the fetus should be allowed to cause harms without any interventions. That just the mere fact that it's a person doesn't justify the harms that a pregnant person would incur, and that means that it's not the characteristic of person does not change the abortion into infanticide. That's the argument here from this mad scientist case. So now let's look at the other side of this whole debate about whether or not personhood is an important consideration for abortion debates here. So on page 240, she talks about animal treatment, and she doesn't really expand on too much. I'm going to do a little bit more than what she does, but I think it's a good analogy to understand why it would be the case that even if the fetus is not a person until it's born, that doesn't seem to justify abortion any more than the previous argument. So imagine that you see a cute dog out the street. You say, oh, look, there's a cute dog, right? We have some sort of initial response that is favorable to this animal, right? Then imagine you go to a testing lab and you see another dog that is being tested on, and you're like, oh, that's really sad. But I understand we need to, do animal testing to find cures for certain things. There's ways to justify it if you want to justify it. I'm an environmental ethicist, so we do a week on animal rights. If you ever get the chance to take a environmental ethics course from me, take it. That's just a shameless plug. But the idea here is that if you see an animal in a lab for testing, it's depressing, but might be a justification if it's going to lead to some type of greater utility later. Now, imagine you see somebody doing something that is absolutely horrid to a dog. I'm not going to try to fill in the blanks for you. I'll let your mind do it. That's why I picked this censored block. So the idea is that just because we think that it's permissible to do some things to a dog, doesn't mean that we think that it's permissible to do everything that we want to a dog, right? And so here the argument is that even with non-humans, even with things like dogs, cats, rabbits, whatever, like there is a clear intuition that just because something's non-human doesn't mean that I get to treat it no matter in any way that I want. And so the same thing is supposed to be applied here, which is that just because the fetus doesn't count as a person doesn't mean that we have the right to do whatever we want to it. That's the reason why this argument about personhood starting after birth doesn't mean that we're just allowed to do whatever we want to the fetus. Sorry, I'm sort of talking circularly there for a second, but that's the crux of the argument. And so I think later on in this section, when she's trying to respond to this more pro-choice view, she says, it is because of coherence of attitudes, I think, that the similarity of a fetus to a baby is very significant. A fetus 1 week before birth is so much like a newborn baby in our psychological space that we cannot allow any cavalier treatment of the former while expecting full sympathy and nutritive support for the latter. Thus, I think that anti-abortion forces are indeed giving their strongest arguments when they point to the similarities between a fetus and a baby, and when they try to evoke our emotional attachment to the sympathy for the fetus. An early horror story from New York about nurses who were expected to alternate between caring for 6-week premature infants and disposing of viable 24-week aborted fetuses is just that, a horror story. These beings are so much alike that no one can be asked to draw a distinction and treat them so very differently. So I like this part here just because I was harping so much on the previous perspective, but I think English is trying to give the other side of this narrative and pointing out that it's not the basis of personhood that's making this justification. It's this sort of psychological coherence of attitudes that it seems like if late term abortions were to happen, then they're very much just like the viable pregnancies, or sorry, they're very much like the premature pregnancies before. And so with that being said, trying to make sure that I've got everything covered here. So yeah, here is the last little bit that I want to end with, which is how she sort of concludes her paper. Again, I'm not trying to present English as the definitive take on abortion. Let's just be clear. I'm going to keep reiterating that throughout this lecture. But I do like how she's trying to provide a cerebral interpretation of what she's presented here, and how both of these arguments seem to fail, and how we sort of find this sort of middle ground. So here's what she says on pages 242 to 243. In the early months of pregnancy, when the fetus hardly resembles a baby at all, then abortion is permissible whenever it is in the interest of the pregnant woman or her family. The reasons would only need to outweigh the pain and inconvenience of the abortion itself. In the middle months, when the fetus comes to resemble a person, abortion would be justifiable only when the continuation of the pregnancy or the birth of the child would cause harms, physical, psychological, economic, or social, to the woman. In the late months of pregnancy, even on our current assumption that a fetus is not a person, abortion seems to be wrong except to save a woman from significant injury or death. So here we're trying to give a more measured, well, not we, but English is trying to give a more measured interpretation of this abortion debate in light of these arguments, without resting on the concept of a person to ultimately decide what's going on here. Instead, she's appealing to this coherence of attitudes and this idea about the self-defense model. As I was saying at the outset of this lecture, I selected the English paper because of its engagement with the person concept. Felt like we hadn't done any of that meta-ethics, what is a person, and figured that would be a good addition to the course here. This paper from Gillen is more of a review article. So on the screen you can see all these different cutoff proposals and what time frame they're sort of associated with. And this is just all reviewed in the article. And what I want to do here is just talk about some of the sort of general talking points that Gillen raises within the paper. So look at the first stance, the fundamentalist moment of conception stance. I think the critical questions that always get posed to this view is, first, why should we believe that a single cell or a clump of cells is a person with the same level of moral importance as we readily acknowledge in each other? And then second, are we really prepared to accept the implications of this view for medical practice, insofar as like it could lead to even saying that post-coital contraception is impermissible because it's preventing a newly fertilized ovum from implanting into the lining of the uterus. So are we really willing to accept the consequences of this view? Those are the two critical questions that are typically posed to this stance. Well, the typical response for people who believe in this view is that it's an argument from potential. And as I was mentioning before, the Don Marquis paper, Why Abortion is Immoral, it rests on this similar argument from potential. Hopefully you also remember when we were talking about moral theories, and I was talking about natural law theory being teleological, and I was connecting it up with Aristotle. So Aristotle's famous case for argument from potential, or potentiality, actuality, I guess I should say, is the acorn into an oak tree. The acorn has a specific type of potentiality, that is to become an oak tree. An acorn doesn't become an apple tree, it doesn't become a shrub, it doesn't become a space shuttle, it only becomes an oak tree. And so when it's flourishing by actualizing that potential. The acorn is growing into an oak tree. And so the argument from potential is similar to this. It's the idea that a fertilized ovum is ultimately got the potential to become this human person, and that if you were to abort it, then you are impeding that natural progression, and insofar as you are stopping the potential from becoming actual, that seems to be morally impermissible. There we go. That's the argument from potential. The response to the argument from potential usually raises this question about, well, a lot of things have potential, and that doesn't necessarily justify why one has greater importance than another one. So the people will sometimes be unpersuaded that this potential imparts the same value to all human embryos and fetuses, right? So the sort of hinge point here, and why I wanted to bring it up, is also to suggest that Marquis paper again, but this argument from potential is trying to make this teleological connection between the fetus is ultimately supposed to become a person, and if you stop it from becoming a person, then you are halting that teleological progression. And there's more to the story there when it comes to metaphysics. If you want to know, it really require understanding Aristotle's teleology there. So it's just looking into that. But again, just trying to do a quick review of these different views, because you might come up against people who will hold them, and I just want you to be prepared to know what how the view is sort of argued for. The second one that gets brought up is the brain life capacity for sentience stance. So here the idea is that a fetus becomes able to feel pain and has brain life at 20 to 24 weeks, and so abortion is permitted before that period, but any time after, then it's impermissible. So a major problem for such an assumption is that if the capacity of sentience is sufficient for personhood and a right to life in human fetuses, why should it not equally be sufficient for personhood and a right to life in other living beings, including all vertebrates that we currently are ready to kill for their meat and skins and uses in medical research? And why I like this is because I'm an environmental ethicist, and this is the concept of speciesism. This is connecting up to Singer's previous point that I was talking about. Why do we make this distinction about sentience being where that's when it becomes morally impermissible to stop kill or abort in this situation? Because a lot of things are sentient, and if sentience is the relevant capacity, then we seem to be committing a number of wrongs. That's the idea here. So if sentience is not accepted as the criterion for full moral status, and abortion continues to be permitted after the stage at which the fetus has developed the capacity to feel pain, then it would seem morally important to ensure that the fetus does not cause pain by the procedure itself. So for late abortions, some form of anesthetic or other means of preventing fetal pain could be part of the abortion operation. That's the second part of this stance here. The next one that Gillen talks about is the concept of viability. Here it's just a short note that the main problem is that viability is entirely dependent on our technological skills. So if you have a premature newborn, we have a number of different resources that can hopefully save their life, but that's only within a certain window. Who knows, in 100 years maybe we will have the technology to save more premature babies' lives, and that's where this concept of viability becomes problematic, because it's not necessarily an objective fact. It's more so about our ability to access certain technology. And also technology is not equally possessed by all hospitals in the world either. So there's the other side of that problem. The next one is the legal criterion. And as Gillen says here, it obviously avoids the difficulties. If you have a law that says this is when it's right and this is when it's wrong, there you go. It's pretty clear cut. The only problem is that there's no particular moral justification for why that time is decided, why somebody counts as a legal person at the time that they do. Imagine how many people who are under the age of 18 are probably more mature than people who are 2 to 3 times older than them, but they're not considered legally a person in the same way, right? So we recognize that just because we assign an age to a certain threshold or a certain moment in development doesn't necessarily mean that everybody, that time frame is appropriate for everybody, yet there is no wiggle room in the legal interpretation of that. So just to bring it up one more time, just because something is a legal norm doesn't mean that's consistent with our moral norms. They're two separate things, and that's what's going on here. Then finally, capacity to be aware of oneself. This is a pretty high threshold, which is not achieved until well after birth. And so usually grounded in the notion that what is remarkable and special and of a special moral importance about human beings is their ability to reflect rationally, to be aware of their moral natures and their responsibilities to others and to themselves, and to be able to make autonomous decisions based on such reflection, to be agents who have free will. And even newborns do not have that, and most kids do not have that for quite some time. And so any argument that leads to the conclusion that newborn babies are not people and do not have a right to life must be flawed and should in any case be rejected for leading to such absurd conclusions. That's what Gillen says, and I tend to agree. But it's based on this idea of rationality, and I won't go too far into it, but as you can see, there are extremes on both ends, where we have the fundamentalist stance, which moment of conception, and then we have the capacity to be self-aware, which is after birth. And the reason that I think it's important to be aware of these is because obviously everybody will sort of have a particular view on the abortion debate, and if you're going to be a healthcare provider, you're going to engage with a number of people or activists or things to that nature. And it's important to understand what's the moral justification for each of these views so you can be able to understand the person that you're engaging with. I think that's the key takeaway from this paper. I know that this lecture has been pretty lengthy, so I'm going to keep this summary pretty short. So we started with the English article, and the reason why we were talking about it was because it concerns this concept of a person, and we showed that it was difficult to base our moral arguments about abortion using the person concept as the central sort of premise for it. So English argues that if a fetus is a person, then abortion is still justifiable in many cases, and if a fetus is not a person, then killing it is still wrong in many cases. And then we were just talking with Gillen's paper about these different proposals, that they just provide different points about when it's permissible for abortion to happen and when it's no longer permissible. And the whole idea there was to just familiarize you with the different perspectives, because all of them have their controversies. Before finishing, I just want to make good on my promise that I was going to finish with the same caveat that I gave at the beginning. And I'll try to not get on my soapbox too much here, but like with the other topics in bioethics that we've covered, like euthanasia, abortion is messy, it's complicated, and I cannot even begin to pretend that I can give you the right answer to the abortion debate. I think as just talking about it in this course, we've only read 2 papers on it, and we read Beecham and Childress. There are people who really focus on this debate, and maybe that they could speak a little bit more, but I think it's important to recognize that none of us are really experts on this abortion debate as we're sitting right here. And I want to just challenge you to develop your critical thinking skills. Try to understand where other arguments are coming from. Be open to listening to the arguments. Not that you have to accept their arguments, but try to understand where the argument is coming from, so it can ultimately help you develop your own argument stronger. That's the way that these things typically happen. I think it's just good practice in philosophy as general, which is why I would always sort of suggest you to take more philosophy courses. I think it was a very eye-opening experience for me. That's why I sort of pursued this route, but you don't have to do that for yourself. You can either way. But I just really want to stress that when we're facing these complicated issues, and what was running through Beecham and Childress's book, the different chapters that we read, I think is really pertinent here. At the end of the day, our responsibility is to look out for the best interests of our patients. Whether or not we're counting the pregnant woman as our main patient, as the fetus as our patient, there is an argument to be made for these different views, and it's our job to make sure that we aren't just brushing off legitimate arguments because they aren't coherent with our own internal arguments for or against a particular practice or a view or anything like that. So just really want to stress that what we're doing here is trying to develop these critical thinking skills so you can really challenge yourself to sharpen your own argument and be open to receiving evidence, revising your argument. I'm not trying to change anybody's mind about any of these debates or anything like that. It's just more about making sure that you are able to navigate the world on your own as an independent person, to be able to make that you're able to justify certain practices to yourself, because at the end of the day, the healthcare field is going to be very taxing. It's going to be very exhaustive. Everybody that I've ever talked to about it, it's very demanding. You're going to experience things that you are not prepared for. And so my job here is just to help you gain a better perspective on other people's arguments that are not your own. And so, all right, I'll get off my soapbox now, but just want to stress one more time that what we're doing here isn't trying to convince one way or another about when abortion's right, when abortion's wrong, when euthanasia is right, when euthanasia is wrong, anything to that extent. Instead, we're just trying to talk about what the arguments are and sort of challenge ourselves to find the better version of our own arguments.